Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. As always, this episode of Lateral Think is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system. The AXIT system uses force platforms, dynamometry and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision making and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use, for practitioners and clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup. It's a fully integrated Bluetooth system. If this sounds like something that would enhance your practice, visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development sent you. So today we are very lucky to have with us exercise physiologist from the Victorian Institute of Sport, Avish Sharma. Avish, tell us, what do you do?
As you say, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. So as John said, I'm a physiologist at the VIS, embedded in the athletics program. So
you only do athletics?
For work, I only do athletics.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, for me, I've been in roles before where I worked across multiple sports, particularly when I was sort of like a PhD student at the AIS. But I have come to the belief for myself, whilst I like variety, I think it's good to have the time to be able to go deep into a certain sport and really make value. I think one thing I've noticed over my career is it's a source of great frustration, both for all of coaches, athletes and staff, when there's just not enough time to really delve into a topic. I mean, on one hand, you've got athletes and coaches that more often than not, that is their life really, is what they're doing, is in the pursuit of excellence in their sport. And then if you're trying to help them, but you're only half a day a week sort of thing, it's very hard to kind of align. Yeah,
that's definitely been I think we've had this discussion, but that's been my frustration with service providers. They're they say they want to get involved and they have the best of intentions, but then you're like, all right, so we're here these days. And they're like, oh, I don't work that day. Oh, I've got something else on. Oh, I'm doing this. And you're like, oh, well, you can't be part of the team.
Yeah. And especially as a physiologist, and I've tended to in my career, stick with the, for lack of a better term, the physiology sports where conditioning and physical fitness and things like that are big determinants of performance. And so there is generally work to be done and you need time to sort of fulfill those tasks. And so I think the biggest thing I'd have as a frustration would be if I worked in a sport like snowboarding. I think that would be so badass. But then if we as a team did a really good job of preparing an athlete and then some person just knocks them out straight away, I think that would be so frustrating. So
well, yes and no. I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it? And I think one of the things that's been really interesting working with you is being the way that you've kind of gone on this journey to try and learn a little bit more about, the events that are not classically physiology driven, or even maybe not even observed to be physiology driven. And we had Justin Rinaldi on actually last week or week before, and it was interesting talking to him because I put forward to him, the difference between, I think, what happens when you go from those physiology-based events, middle distance up, and said, how do you look at this kind of stuff? And he's cool because he kind of doesn't really look at things in a way that most coaches, I think, do who have more science background. He's very straightforward. Yeah. I thought I was being clever, and I said, oh, well, what's the trick to getting someone to run under 1 minute 45? And he said, get him to run 51 in the first lap, 53 in the second. I'm like, okay, that's a good fucking answer.
Yeah.
But from your end, what are you enjoying about this process so far?
My move to Melbourne was it was almost, so a bit of background, I'd been at the AIS for a few years doing my PhD, which was in athletics and very much in sort of
what
endurance.
Was it on? I think you have told me.
I'll take a bit of a segue here. I think no. I will tell you.
Are you going on a tangent?
It was in altitude training for runners, but I think the thing that I enjoyed the most about my PhD is that I think most research is, and hopefully I get this the right way around, is research is designed in a way to lead to practice that is research based or research informed, whereas I thought what I did was actually research that is practice informed. Yes. And I really enjoyed that because essentially how I explain my PhD to people is taking ideas that coaches had been employing for 50 years of altitude training and just trying to explain it and see what kind of came out.
It's interesting you say that, obviously we have a shared colleague in Tudor Bitter.
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting about Tudor is he went on this journey early in his career when he was at WACE and then at the AIS, where he coached mostly 400 and 400 meter hurdlers, and there is that sort of transition across from being really technical and speed focused and probably more mechanical and biomechanical in nature to understanding the physiology for that interplay. And he said, like, one of the first things that when he did have access to these services was asking the physiologist, all right, tell me what this session actually does, because I think it does this, but I don't know that it does that. And then they'd measure and he goes, like, it doesn't do anything like what you think it does.
As in, like, he didn't think it did anything that he thought it does, or?
So, like, say, for instance, like, you might do a session that's, you think is highly anaerobic and is really good for developing, say, lactic tolerance. But actually, when you actually measure, say, someone's lactate during, or their blood lactate levels during the session, it didn't follow what he thought it would. Now, I didn't ask him specifically like what that looks like, but he was like, okay, that makes me realize what I think I'm doing is not what I think I'm doing. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because I think one of the cool things about working with someone like yourself is you kind of get to pull the curtain back a little bit and go, okay, what's happening underneath the hood?
Yeah.
Well, actually, on that question, something that I'm interested to know is what does a typical day look like for you working with in athletics?
Yeah, just on that point, and I'll get to the day, like what my day looks like, is that I just like the problem solving element of what I do, and it literally is like, so most of my job really is essentially quality assuring training programs is how I would describe it. So where I think I can be most effective and where I try and steer my job is away from the stuff that's like, oh, Avish, like how much time should my athletes spend in an ice bath, or like what altitude training intervention should they do? Like that's all relevant and it'll come at some point, but most of it I think should be like, okay, I'm thinking about prescribing this week and this for the next month. Like what does that look like? These are the goals, these are the races and all that. So it's really, I think, mostly around training program design. And so with that as like sort of the core goal, a day could look like, a series of catch-ups with coaches, like checking in on athletes in the gym, doing some reading or whatever, just to, if there's a curly question that's come through and I don't know the answer, I'll obviously got to go try and find it. So yeah, that's kind of like the main structure of what I do.
Do you do a lot of testing in the lab?
Yes and no. I think this year I've sort of gone back to doing a bit more testing. So on the question about my background, my last role was at Triathlon Australia and I was in sort of more of a national lead role. So I was still employed as a physiologist, but had to get involved in things like, strategy design for the organisation and like delivering a heat protocol for Tokyo and things like that. So, and also just by the nature of the sport is that we were decentralised for our summer across Australia and then for the European summer across the world sort of thing. So there wasn't actually enough time to kind of get in the lab with the athletes. Whereas now I'm sort of employed by the VIS for 6 months of the year. The athletes are mostly in Melbourne and mostly, within close enough to the VIS, it's actually practical for them to come in. So I have been doing a lot more testing, and that is one thing that sort of, I guess, feeds into, my process and of like helping the coaches and trying to explain some of the things that they might ask me about, training.
I was going to actually, another question I was going to ask, sort of similar to yours. Do you find that a lot of coaches have good intuition about when they set a training program, this is what they think they're working on and actually it is?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I think I've been quite lucky. Like I've worked, predominantly the sports I've worked in are swimming and athletics when I was in Canberra, then triathlon and now back in athletics. So, and I've been fortunate enough both across Paralympic and Olympic to work with some really, really good coaches that I've learned a lot from and hopefully impacted them as well. And I think like, to me, coaches, they're in how do I describe this? They're in like basically a new experiment every day. Like they're in trial and error every day. And then gradually through experience, they'll like, hone their ideas and figure out what works and things like that. So to answer the question, do they have good intuition? Generally, absolutely. Like I think something I've come around to over time is like, they might not always know why, but they will know generally what works. At least they'll know what works for the athletes in front of them. They may not have the tools at all times to know what will work for all sorts of different athletes, and maybe that's something that I can come in and help them with, or people like me can help them with. But in general, in my experience, I think coaches, you sort of give like, I think they're generally the first person I ask if I have, a problem and we don't know sort of where to steer the ship. Like, I think essentially that's their job, really.
Yeah, so when you say they're always in trial and error, is that more about understanding the individual athlete and how they respond to different training stimulus, or is it more related to how can I actually continue to improve the performance of my athletes?
And so I should probably clarify that point. By saying they're always in trial and error, I don't mean that they're always changing their ideas every day because they're getting it wrong. I mean that the opportunity for coaches to trial and error, I would say, is the most. Like they're the ones that are generally the architect of the program and things like that. Like in some instances, I'll have a large role in the prescription side of things, but it's always sort of directed by the coach. And I think they've got the most control over, whether they want to try something new, whether they want to tweak something a little bit or whatever. And yes, I think most of it is generally like, okay, say we've got a squad of 100 meter sprinters and I'm doing this session with them and I know it's kind of working for like 60 or 70% of them, but then how do I get it working for like the others? And then that's where sort of like this iterative process, I think, comes in.
Yeah. I think a better way to describe that is as setting up safe to failed experiments, because trial and error just makes it sound like, let's just give it a go and see what happens. But the reality is it's actually pretty well informed and like, well, what are the parameters we can set up to see if this actually works without actually making sure that they don't fall apart.
In your experience, what do you think are some of the features of the coaches that get that right, that understand what that process is about? Because I think one of the clear things that coaching has taught me is to get really comfortable with being uncertain and being willing to, as I said, we talk about safe to fail, but like run these little experiments where you're generally trying to pass out what, as you said, is good for that individual who maybe isn't fitting in that general model that you've maybe developed for, or system that you've developed for your athletes.
I would say in terms of, and I'll try to keep this general so it applies to few different sports, I would say the two traits that I would think would be fearlessness and like humility. So fearlessness in the sense that it's not that like you're like, oh, I don't give a shit if it's wrong, but it's like you're not, that's not a limiting factor for you. Like
you're not being conservative, basically.
Fearless in trying to try something new, and then humble enough to realize that like your secret sauce, someone else has probably had that before, and it's like, just because it's worked the one time, it doesn't mean it's going to always work and things like that. So it's just about like being open-minded enough to be like, oh, maybe there is something better. And actually, I'll add a third one, and sort of just on that, it's almost like the flip side is, I'd call it confidence, is like actually being able to back yourself in when you do think you're on a good thing. And even if you have people like myself or other team members being like, oh, no, I think it'll be better. It's like, no, I'm actually pretty like, I think this will be good. And just having the confidence to like go for it. And then that taps into the fearlessness, because if it ends up being wrong, it's like, okay, well, at least I tried.
Have you actually seen that yourself, where a coach is going, you know what, I think this is what we need to do for this athlete, and you've gone, look, I'm not so sure about that from my perspective, but it actually, they've actually been onto a good thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like, I don't know if I really have like an anecdote on the tip of my tongue or whatever, but it happens all the time actually. And I think something that I've noticed in my own development is I take that less personally. I think when you're young, it's really easy to be like, oh, I've got like the evidence behind my ideas and this is the mechanism and all this. And the coach will be like, nah, but we're just going to do this anyway. And now I've gone more into like, I'll just present my idea like as it is. And ultimately, like it's going to be, I have the faith and confidence that the coach, and in some cases the athlete, if it's relevant, like they've listened and taken it on board, and then they've decided to go in another direction. That's fine. It doesn't stop me doing my job. I actually think that's healthy. It's like we don't always have to agree on everything. Actually, I think if we agree on everything, that's probably like...
That's dangerous, because then you don't know whether the person's actually thinking for themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting you say that, because I feel like it's the common trait, or those traits that you brought forward are really common in the coaches that you see that are very successful. They have a boldness that you think, okay, like, are they being arrogant? Yet when it fucks up, they'll take responsibility and be like, oh, well, that didn't work. It was my fault. I tried this. It didn't quite come together. Let's try this. And I think that's a really interesting combination, because in general, you see people who tend to be really bold tend to tip over into arrogance instead of confidence. And when something goes wrong, they start pointing the finger at someone else. And I think, I always say this to Jack, but like, I think coaching more than anything is created a humility for me that I think people find weird. Like even recently, Jack and I, we had a fucking Barney about something. And I found it interesting because like, both of us, I think, very quickly realised, okay, like we've overstepped each other's kind of confidence here. And it was interesting because I think it demonstrated a level of humility for both of us. We were like, okay, yeah, we fucked up, right? We apologized to each other and moved on. I don't know that would happen in a lot of places unless you're willing to be open to learning in that kind of way. Yeah. And I personally just think coaching has done that for me. Otherwise, it takes kind of quite unique personalities to get to that.
Yeah. Yeah. On that note, I'm interested to hear both of your perspectives, because I often get concerned, for someone like myself, I like to read a lot of research, and as you start to understand more mechanisms, I think it helps to justify, like, oh yeah, my ideas are right because I've got these, I know the mechanisms behind it, where I imagine a lot of coaches probably don't think that way. They're very much more about the art and the experience of it.
I think that's exactly what, like, for me, it's always the thing that I come back to, of like the results matter much more than whether I understood the mechanism.
And the other thing with
that is kind of tricky, because early in my coaching I thought I was so clever and I was like, oh, I know why this happens and I'm going to do this and I'm going to design that. And then they run like a bag of dicks and you're like, well, that wasn't right.
Well, I think the other thing too you got to remember is when you implement any type of training stimulus, there's multiple mechanisms being in play. So, I mean, there might be some key ones. You might be thinking like this particular molecular pathway has been upregulated, which I'm sure it is. But then, and this is probably a good question for you, Avish, of like, what are the other systems that are being involved? And do we also run into the issue of, if we're only thinking about, say, for instance, training stimulus and not all the other factors that determine someone's performance and recovery, do we run into issues or limitations?
That's the thing. It's like when you can measure something, you think that's the important thing. So I was
just going to say, like, I've had a few, like, kind of, I don't know if this has been the same for you guys, but I can almost, like, if someone were to ask me what are like the 10 most influential moments in your career, I reckon I could actually do a half decent job of kind of trying to articulate them. So
one.
Actually,
you can do it. I'll be bloody impressed.
We'll see where it takes us.
No, but this one that I want to share is sort of this thing that came from a scientific angle around like being holistic. And so it was one of my colleagues who was one of the first physios that I worked with, and he was telling me about this sort of breast cancer research that he happened across, and it was something along the lines of like, this research team found that there were something outrageous, like 100,000 or like 1 million risk factors can actually like underpin breast cancer. And we're only good at measuring like, I don't know, 7 of them. And so that is so dangerous because it creates such a bias to what you can actually measure and what's in front of you. And I found that at certain times in my career, particularly like a while ago when I was sort of first coming up, you sort of have a narrow focus on the science that you're doing in a PhD. Like I was very much in that, and it's been good over time to sort of just like realize that there's actually like a lot more going on.
Well, you go from that transition from the unknown unknowns to at least the known unknowns, you know, of like, you might be like, okay, there's a lot of things I still don't know, I might not be able to measure, but at least I'm aware that I need to think outside of the box or take into consideration these things might be important.
But sorry, just getting back to your question was around like, is it too dangerous to be narrow-minded on training stimulus? Or I would say absolutely yes, because there's so many other things that, you know, that even if the three of us spent an hour trying to articulate everything, we'd probably only scratch the surface.
So if that's the case, what do you do? Because I think that's the thing that fucks with most people is you want to be systematic. You want to take what is considered a scientific approach as a modern coach or a modern sort of sports performance system. And you end up in this position where you're measuring lots of things, but ultimately the thing that is important is the performance. And as we've just said, that it's made up of so many things. So how do you actually attack that? And from your point, how do you help, say, coaches and athletes get that message across?
I think what I articulate my role as is to either increase certainty or to reduce uncertainty. And how I do that is by kind of just putting in a basic framework of like, all right, these are some fundamental physiological and scientific principles I think that apply to training. And I think as I relate to working with the team, I'll bring that to the table and sort of try keep it to that, like in the sense of, I don't think it excludes me from like, you know, experimenting or doing like having some wild ideas and let's just try it. But I think just coming back to some core fundamentals around like, you know, training prescription, progressive overload, all these things that you sort of learn in your basic sciences and physiology 101 and stuff. And then sort of like using that as a platform and then kind of like, you know, just going from there, really.
So do you have like a baseline sort of foundation of, you know, whether they're measures or features that you will straight away start to talk to, and let's start with the more physiology heavy, endurance type sports or even field sports. Do you go, okay, these are the key parameters that I think you need to be touching, or not really?
No, I just go in and try and form the relationship and just ask a shit ton of questions.
Well, I was actually just a similar question to what you asked. I was going to say, what do you do to essentially like probe an individual to get an idea of who this person is and what's going to be the appropriate training stimulus for them?
To be honest, it's like I don't go in with like a set template of questions kind of thing. I honestly usually just rock up at training and just start observing and then go from there. Really, like, and it can go in any which direction. Like, I don't really have anything more to say than that in terms of an approach. Like I guess like how it works for me generally is like I'll be directed to a certain coach by like either by Athletics Australia or the VIS and the people that I sort of report to, and like, okay, Avish, like, you know, John's got a few athletes that are, you know, likely to make the team, and we want to make sure that, you know, he's got a productive relationship. So I'll just go to training, and then, I mean, it was really interesting for me coming to sprints because I'd work with sprinters in swimming, but just because of the differences in the sport, like they train like endurance athletes a lot of the time. Like just to give you an example, like, you know, a 50-meter freestyler, the event goes for 20 seconds if you're a really good male, and 23 seconds if you're a really good woman. So like the 200 meters, they train like, I would say 4 or 5 times the amount of like our running sprinters kind of thing. And
why is that?
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of stuff around feel of the water, and it's such a technically driven sport that like, you know, there's
I see it very differently. I think to me it's because obviously gravity's not involved. So the actual mechanical stress that their body undertakes,
the rate of force development
is so much lower that the actual internal stress that they're creating allows them to get more volume, and you actually need that volume in order to create the stressor. It's like how you would know, I don't understand it as well, but why on a bike, like you can never get your heart rate anywhere near what you can when you're running. Yeah,
it's an interesting, because I've been, what you guys think, like if you could find a way to like almost eliminate the weight bearing consideration of running, and actually we could train the same amount as our equivalent events in non-weight bearing sports, do you think we'd have better athletes? So it's like saying like I'm limited to have a 800 meter runner spend 10 hours of their week on legs, like that's all they can do because otherwise they'll just get injured. But what if they could train like 20 hours a week?
It's called drugs. It is. That's what drugs does. Yeah. It's not that it like actually change. Well, you probably understand it better, but it's not that it changes so much of the factors related to the actual performance themselves. It allows you to train more and recover. That's why that people, you know, people take growth hormone because it allows your tissue to recover from that tissue loading.
Well, I'm about to say, I think that's where you need to think about whether the biomechanical components to the sport versus the physiological components. Because the other thing I think of, say, with running, and particularly with the shorter the distance, is the biomechanical demands create different neuromuscular patterns and different behavior in the myofascial system. When you think about something like dynamic muscle architecture, where you could do all the volume to create, say, potentially metabolic stress, but you're not going to be able to replicate the neural patterns and the loading of the connective tissue relative to the muscle to optimize adaptations that they need.
In shorter events, I don't think so. I think the thing that you need to be able to do is expose them to more of that mechanical stress, and usually what happens is they get to a point where they can't tolerate any more of it, and they'll either break or get some sort of soft tissue injury. So that becomes the limiting factor, and that, I think we've spoken about this, that changes individual to individual. And like when I say drugs, I'm not saying that to be a smart ass. It's actually really clear if you look at, say, a lot of the programs of, say, the Soviets during the 50s, 60s and 70s, especially if you look at a lot of their jump programs. So there's some really cool videos if you're interested, like looking at Soviet jump training, and there's heaps of plyometrics on there. And the reason they got away with that is because they were taking anabolic steroids and other sort of factors to maintain that. And now a lot of people have tried to, you've seen over periods of time, people tried to implement that amount of mechanical stimulus, and they actually just cannot tolerate it. They get stress fractures, they get tendon injuries or overload problems, and then they end up not being, their joints end up becoming really degraded. And the reason, however, what you found was if you can tolerate that and you can increase the amount of mechanical loading that you can go through, your performance goes through the roof. And that's why, we saw periods where, especially with the Soviets, their jumping programs were so extensively good for a really long time.
So how do you try and increase the amount of mechanical loading your athletes can tolerate?
Well, it's an interesting game because it seems like as time goes on, athletes that start out seem to be less and less tolerant of mechanical loads, which I don't know. I was talking even to, do you know Mark Stewart?
Yeah.
The pole vault coach?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to him about this because obviously he's much older than me and has much more experience coaching people across periods of time. And I said to him, have you noticed that the amount of loading that your athletes can tolerate as they come into your program is less than the past? He said, yes. He said, but the trick to that is starting them early. You know, and I think that's one of the errors that, not errors, it's one of the things that I think is limiting me at the moment is that I tend to only coach adults, right? And that's on purpose for lots of different reasons. But I think ultimately if I'm going to be able to have success, I probably need to consider starting with 13, 14-year-olds where you start them at a very low level with some of this mechanical load and increase that over time.
So during that like really highly adaptable phase, they actually tolerate ground reaction forces more and more.
You know, you deal with all of my athletes on a day-to-day basis because you're part of our team in terms of, you know, the healthcare side of it. And as you can see, there's such a vast difference in how much mechanical loading some of them can take.
Yeah, massive.
You know, like even if you take, you know, my wife Kendra, she can tolerate way more mechanical loading than some of the athletes that I have that I've only been with the last couple of years because the coaches that she had when she was 12 to 16 actually did a pretty good job of exposing her to a lot. Now at the time you're probably like that was a lot of training and maybe there were dangerous and deleterious effects of that. But you know, like completely touch wood.
Yeah.
You know, she's 33 years old. She made her first games in the Olympics, her first ever international team at 31. Was running personal bests. She ran personal best 2 weeks out from the games. She doesn't have any joint injuries. She's had a few issues over the years with like tendon injuries and like overuse type stuff. But right now, like there's nothing physically in any way that limits her training, right? And I think that, you know, both of us have to be very grateful to the coaches that she had in the past that actually exposed her to quite a reasonable stimulus of mechanical loading, right? And those are features that I think if you do slowly and you do them early, we have that adaptability as, you know, a complex biological system.
Actually, speaking of which then, John, just going back to your question, have you found anything or do you know of any of coaches using any other type of training stimulus to build maximal speed, you know, apart from actually being on the track? Is there anything that really has translation, do you think?
No.
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think, and you know, this comes back to exercise classification and everyone, I think we've spoken about this heaps of times, but the person I think that's documented this the best is Bondarchuk, you know, and he's got his books. Some of them are translated pretty poorly. If you want to look at some of the stuff, Derek Everly's done a really good job along with the guys at Hammer Media have done a really good job of kind of translating Bondarchuk's work. But essentially, I don't know if you've seen it, I think, and the images from a physiologist from the UK named Tom Crick that they did during the period where they were getting ready for the 2020 Olympics. But it's the triangle with like competitive exercise, special development exercises, special preparatory exercises, and then general exercises. And you categorize your exercises based on that. And that was all based on Bondarchuk's research where he
took me through some of that stuff.
Yeah, he did surveys actually of thousands of Soviet athletes trying to look at correlations between their level of performance and, say, task. We spoke about this before of like what transfers and what doesn't. You know, and it's really interesting because even, you know, his sport was hammer throw and he coached 3 consecutive hammer throw gold medalists, drugs or not drugs. He still sort of he coached, you know, Yuri Sadiq, who is still the whole world record holder for the hammer, and really pioneered even a lot of the technical side of things. But one of the things I think he did was the organisation of training into a much more complex approach and something that looked very heavily into, well, does having a 200 plus kilo back squat, does that transfer to performance for throws or not? Does it transfer to sprints? Does it transfer to statistics? Whatever it is. And that was really interesting to see. And you can still, like, even now, you'll be able to find them pretty quickly. You look up the correlation tables that he's created. And there's a correlation up to a point. But beyond that point, it's almost like there's the minimum standard. But beyond that point, getting, say, stronger or getting more powerful doesn't translate. The things that translate are more exposure to training that's exactly the kind of stuff that you need. So the competitive exercise, whether that's more racing, whether that's more, you know, if it's 800, more reps that are in that zone of what you run for 600 to 1,000 meter distances. Those are the things that translate the most. However, you've got to have the base of that pyramid to support doing a lot of that training. Because if you don't, as I said, you break because the mechanical stress associated with that kind of training or stimulus makes you fall apart if you're not prepared for it.
I imagine too the correlation starts to become worse or better based on the training history or maturation of the individual. Because like if they've got no training history, you're probably going to see a lot more correlation between, oh wow, they're building up their back squat and their performance is getting better.
And I think you see this with kids, you know, and it's like one of the things that I think actually destroys a lot of coaches is they fall into this false sense of security where increasing the amount of stress stimulus to an adolescent, for instance, will improve their performance even if it's more general in nature because it's actually just expanding their envelope of capability. Yeah. So we see this a lot where they'll throw all this training at a young kid, the kid gets way better, then they think that that's how you coach people. And there's this really common thing that I see, and I'm sure you've actually probably even had to deal with this, where someone's had someone since they're a junior, they take them to being a very good developing athlete or on the cusp of, say, making teams, or maybe they get to a team, but then they need to go from being a representative to being, say, a contender, and that's a very different equation because what you did in the past may not actually be useful now. And the reason is because what you did before was maybe more of the base of that pyramid, and that's what they needed at that time. But now you need to find a way of doing more of the pointy end without losing that base. And that's not what they know. What they know is we did more of this, they got better, so we're just going to keep doing more of that.
There's so much in like all this that I find fascinating. Like sometimes I think like, oh, in athletics, if we ditched World Juniors, our senior performances would actually be better in some contexts.
I think so, but it also puts a stake in the ground. And I think that's
absolutely. And it keeps people motivated to actually like get a jersey, be connected.
Why do you think it would improve their performance?
For exactly some of the reasons that John just articulated, in the sense that like because there's a goal and a target there. Different the type training will have a short-term focus to try and achieve that goal. It might not be in service of long-term performance. But something you said I found fascinating with Kendra around like you're quite grateful that she was exposed to sort of almost these higher training loads as an adolescent. There's something that we grapple with a lot when I was at Triathlon around like, because it was almost like the inverse that we were looking for, these like, really physiologically gifted athletes that actually came from a really low training base, because then you knew it was on like talent. And then if you just were able to like kind of increase their training like slowly,
it depends on what age they are.
I just find it in the endurance sports, I think like that's the kind of the general way. But then on the other hand, it's like if you look at the typical training volumes that athletes need to do as senior athletes to be successful, like what's the optimal way of preparing them for those the years?
It's the Ingebrigtsen model. For guys that are interested in that, Ingebrigtsen's been training almost like he has since he was, particularly, the one who's doing really well. Obviously, he's got a couple of older brothers that were very good as well. But the dad, you basically sacrificed the older two so that he could get to...
Was it failing safely?
Safety fails experiments,
And now they're at a point where they've got a guy who's in his early 20s. He's already won Olympic gold. He's won Europeans. He's won worlds. He's not that far off the world record. At some stage, I'm sure they're going to try and attack it over 1,500.
His interview at Worlds after he lost the 5K and then won the 15, it was like one of the most surreal things I've ever seen.
I didn't see it.
He was just like, he was on Letron, I think, and he was just like, how did you win, Jakob? And he's like, I was just better. It was like, what did you do? I just ran faster than the other guys. And it was just delivered with this, like, you couldn't tell if he was just being like an arrogant jerk or he just had like, I think it was just he had such self-belief in what he did. And like, it was like, well, how do you explain when you lost to Jacob Whiteman in the 1500? He's like, I just made a mistake and I didn't run fast enough. Like, it was almost like he was talking about JR. It's like, you run 51 and you run 53. Like, sometimes it's that simple.
And I think that's the thing that, with someone like him, it's very, very obvious because from the age of, say, 10, he's been training like an elite athlete. And I think one of the things, and this is, I'd be interested to get your opinion on this. I have this argument with people all the time because I think that there's so much.
Are we about to have this argument?
No. We're not about to have an argument. I think you're smart enough not to go down that path. But
fall down that trap.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting is people, I think particularly in Australia, but I think it's all over the world, get enamored by talent. And one of the things that I think is actually a talent is the ability to tolerate training.
Yeah, 100%.
We don't respect that. We respect the person that on the surface has done stuff all and comes out and can perform. But often they're the people who, when you try and input some of that training, they actually don't have a lot of growth.
Yeah.
So you're talking about like more the ceiling that they have as opposed to the psychological attributes, or I guess both really?
No, I'm talking more about the ceiling.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking physiologically. And I think you put this into context too, like you talked about having that difference. Have you seen much of the work of Gregory Meyer and Avery Feigenbaum?
No.
So they're youth resistance training researchers. You know, they're the guys that usually write the position statement for the NSCA and all that kind of stuff. They're really well respected, say, in the strength and conditioning world, particularly for adolescent and youth, you know, neuromuscular performance development. And there's a really cool paper that Meyer's the lead author, and it basically shows that the earlier you start neuromuscular training, and what they mean by that is, you know, strength features, items related to, you know, coordination and, you know, say for instance exposure to resistance movements within the gym, plyometrics, jumping, all that kind of stuff. The earlier you start that, whether that be pre-puberty, during puberty or post-puberty, essentially sets your ceiling for how much growth you're going to have. So if you start that earlier, your ceiling is higher than if you started during puberty versus, you know, after puberty. And I think this is one of the things that we often get wrong is we'll get someone who turns up really late and we go, oh, they've got lots of ability, but they actually haven't been exposed to their growth. Their ceiling is not there. And I think that that's one of the things that's, to me, is interesting because it also highlights as well the one key feature that we see a lot talked about with specialization, which is, I think one of the reasons that people do really well when they've come from, say, a multi-sport background is that their neuromuscular development has kind of, it might be broad, but they've expanded it, and it means that their ceiling is there. So, I'm almost starting to shift towards the opposite view of like, if you haven't done stuff, I'm worried that you don't have much growth.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I like that. Just a simple phrase around, you know, talent, but in terms of training tolerance, because I think, as you say, talent is more often thinking about psychological traits, like these athletes that are like really just like they'll run through the brick walls and things like that. And then there's like talent from like the purely, you know, like, you know, this person can run 3-minute Ks, but then also high jump 210 when they're like 17. Like, and I think that tolerance element is like almost...
It's like the bridge almost. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't look at and they don't think about. And I think, as I said, people get so attracted to talent. That, you know, there's that 17-year-old who can just come out and do it. But it doesn't always mean that they've got the growth in them.
I think it's a really important thing, and sort of just making my brain tick as I am talking to you guys right now, because like I still think... I know I used to say it in triathlon a bit. It's like the athletes that win are still like the best athletes. And I don't mean that in the sense that they're the ones that come first, second and third. They're the best in terms, I still think they're the most talented. And I think, you know, at certain times we needed to put more work into our just identifying who are the athletes that are going to be successful. And we sort of went down this great journey of like, you know, looking at holistic measures and things and all that sort of thing.
Well, actually on that, can I ask a question? Were there things in those, and like, I'm going to use a phrase that people probably don't like, but like the winners versus the losers, right? Because I've been getting really caught up in this concept and thinking about it a lot of like, some people just find a way of winning. Right? And I say that not in that they win everything, but they get the best out of themselves, right? And sometimes they may not have as much talent, but I still classify them as the better athlete. You know, when they've got the opportunity, they find the way of getting what they've got and they can give it to you. Then you have the people that I call that they're almost perpetual losers. They can be super talented and they might be capable of performances, but they just don't find a way of doing it. Sometimes when it doesn't, when it matters, some like, and I think there's, I know that in preparation for this, we spoke about like potentially psychological features, and I think that they're intertwined. But I'm really caught up in this kind of concept because I think there's something about those measures, and I wonder if the stuff you guys looking at with those holistic features in triathlon, did that bring anything up?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think, I mean, as a physiologist, like talent ID and talent selection was not an area that was immediately like familiar to me. So I did like quite a bit of like reading and research and talked to a whole different amount of people. And what I realized very quickly was that like anything physiological and things like that, it's not very predictive whatsoever. Like these like typical measures like, you know, VO2 max and all this, and doesn't actually tell you anything.
That's the thing that always makes me think like, okay, there's way more to this picture.
Absolutely. And so like very quickly it became evident that, and again, I started out by looking at published stuff, and then more and more I'd just go and have conversations with people that had done it before, and whether they were coaches or people that had just been in the sport for a long time, or just, you know, people from completely outside but had done it in different contexts. And I think like it became more and more evident to me that things like in the psychological space, and maybe we'll just call it psychological talent for now, like things like self-regulation, determination, all these things, there are probably better terms that we could use, but for the sake of now, I'll just go with them, that seem to be a lot more predictive and a lot more interesting to look at when you're trying to, like, you know, narrow down 100 kids.
What were some of the features in that profile?
I think mostly self-regulation, at least in the published research.
When you say self-regulation, what are you talking about?
Like, I think the way I interpret it is just like, you know, and I'll use a practical example, is just like the ability to like sort of self-analyze, assess. So if you've done a training session, like what went well, what didn't go well, setting yourself goals and all in that space. I'm probably not doing a great job of articulating it, but to me it's just around like, it's almost around self-accountability and ownership, but also being able to like frame up your own goals. Like a practical sense is like almost an athlete just writing down notes in their diary about how their training session went.
Do you think that this relates to their general understanding of, you know, like self-analysis and as people, or do you think it's different?
I don't know. I think it's that's a really good question, because I think like at some times I thought we kind of went down this idea of like, oh, we need athletes that are like students of the sport, and I was like no, but sometimes like athletes, like they could even not really know that much about their competitors and things like that, but they still go out and kick their ass. Like I don't know. So for me it was just like, just almost like a type of self-awareness about where you are.
I'm talking about self-awareness.
We spoke about this last week of talking about subjective versus objective measures for looking at performance, and with all the looking at the literature, subjective always outperforms objective measures when you look at, you know, physiological, immunological, whatever it is. And I know looking at some of there was a systematic review published in 2016. The lead author's name was Saw.
I know that one.
And if you look at some of the subjective measures that they use, a lot of it is like regulating emotions, because obviously people get angry or sad, but how much you can regulate that so you don't actually have a negative stress response from it. I think one of the big issues you have with people who have, say, I don't know how you describe, maybe low emotional IQ or self-awareness is emotions can get the better of them, which creates quite a negative stress response, and therefore their ability to recover or even the inflammatory response from the training stimulus is much larger, and therefore takes longer to actually
This is actually making me think that like we should potentially, like, and again, this is my coaching brain ticking on, but like potentially do we put people through a course of almost self-awareness where you're like, okay, what are the traits that I know that I typically come up with, and starting to understand, well, actually I do emotionally get upset by my performance, therefore maybe it's important that if that happens, I can recognize that that's happening and then change what I'm doing. Because I think...
Because you can ruminate on those negative emotions for a really long time, which actually doesn't serve a good purpose.
Well, as you said, it's going to lead to really negative stress response, you know, and that negative stress is not going to lead to performance improvement.
No.
You know, if you're carrying that into the next week of training or the next few weeks or the next competition, you're not going in, with the mindset of like, how do I nail this? You're going in with the mindset of like, I'm a piece of shit.
Well, and the way I look at it too is stress is useful because it essentially provides a signal to the system that it needs to adapt. But that only works if it's within a short acute period. You know, there seems to be this issue with people who are experiencing prolonged stress because they're depressed, they're anxious, they have poor emotional regulation. They're on this they're under this chronic state which seems to be very negative in terms of being able to build up your sensory motor system and skill acquisition, your ability to sleep, your ability to recover. So it seems that the good people can have that negative emotional response of like, shit, I lost. I don't want that to happen again. What do I need to do? And all of a sudden you've created this centrally mediated state of, I need to change to improve, and therefore you create a system or a situation where, I don't know if it happens maybe at an epigenetic level where it's like, all right, give us the stimulus we need and we're going to make sure we maximize the response.
To be honest, on a lot of these things, I got down to just ask the coach. Like honestly, on a lot of these things, is like these sort of like complex psychological ideas, and even some of the physiological ones, I just got down to holistic is good, and then people that like know their shit about a certain sport. And so like some coaches that were very successful is like, sometimes I can just tell from like the way they get out of their car at training and things like that.
You can tell by the demeanor.
Yeah, exactly. And so I felt like that's something that we need to try do a better job of like systematizing, because it's not realistic that you have an expert coach in every like talent hotbed that you can like watch how everyone rocks up to training. But it's like, and this is an open question because I don't think we got to it, but it's like, how do you systematize some of these like completely subjective things that are actually like
very
probably
important,
closer to the truth than like some survey that you can, there's this really interesting thing going on at the moment in kind of like Australian sport. It's in relation to data that I think like all data we collect is going to be classed as like health information, which then changes like how it's treated and things like that. But anyway, like whether you agree or not with that is not the point. Personally, I think we sometimes fall into the trap of collecting way too much information and not doing anything with it. So I'm actually really interested to see what happens. But anyway, in reading some of the documentation around it, there was just this one or two sentences that I found really interesting. And it was like, we feel like in this like age of like all this information, we're forgetting about the ability of humans to distill complex sources of information into simple things. And I know there's like, AI and stuff that's coming along that can probably do that as well. But I think like that just that line, like ability to distill complex like inputs into a recommendation, like that's something that we shouldn't lose. And we shouldn't try and like, we need this like objective questionnaire where actually if you ask a coach with experience or knowledge, like they'll just be able to tell you.
And more importantly too, if you've got some questionnaire, it's quite impersonable. So how someone reads a question and answer, it's going to be very different to going like, how you doing today? And actually
100%.
getting an idea of what's their body language, what's their eye contact like, what's their tone of voice.
It's funny you say that because, the discussions that I have with Tudor, one of the things that we talk about is, funnily enough, like one of the things that often tends to be a huge factor in when someone has good performances or even like a good period of training is, like, are they generally quite happy in their life? Because if they are, you tend to get good results that come out, which on the surface seems like such a simplistic and kind of almost naive way of looking at it. But I think it comes down to exactly what you're saying of like, if they're in a state that means that they're able to absorb stresses, as you mentioned before, Jack, they're probably going to adapt to their training better, even if the training stimulus is not perfect.
Well, an example of that is I remember I think it must have been Monday, we'll give you context, Saturday evening, we went to a wedding. It was one of a runner who used to be in John's track squad, and so a lot of John's track athletes are there. And I remember talking to one of your athletes early this week, and they said on the Sunday, their mega wave readings were like the best have actually ever been, basically ever. And part of that is because she was at a wedding, had a really good time, really enjoyed herself. And so obviously that social component to it had a big impact on having a positive stimulus on her neural system. And I think that just really highlights what you're saying here with being holistic of, you can't just look about the training stimulus or just the objective measures in themselves, because you're missing sometimes the bigger picture.
And more and more as my practice has developed over, like I've been doing this since 2013, like more and more as my practice has developed, I've like looked outside and of my discipline and kind of just tried to get the bigger picture of like, where does this actually fit in? And I was part of a workshop the other day at the VIS, which I thought was really interesting and a good thing to do, just about optimizing our performance teams. And a comment that I made was like, if you were to like hypothetically try and write out the job description of every member of a performance team, to me, the coach is really the only one who's in their job description would be to like look at things holistically, because they're the only one to me that has to like rank at a certain point in time, rank like physiology below nutrition but above psychology, and like, you know, between biomechanics and this, whereas like a good practitioner will have some awareness of that, but it's actually not my job to try and work out like all the time, like where it kind of like sits.
It's such a good point, because it's something that I think I've really struggled with, as I said early on in this talk, with service providers that aren't necessarily thinking that way.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm trying to say to them, well, I'm thinking about 10 different things at the same time. You're thinking about one and trying to tell me that's the most important, and it's because it's the thing that you look after.
Yeah.
But understand that, like, in my priority list, you're number 7 at the moment. So just calm the fuck down.
I think it's an interesting balance, because, like, I think, like, I've just gotten to the point now I just kind of, like, ask the coaches directly, like, how they would like me to operate. Because I think, like, if I, say, just started 100% of the time thinking in this, like, sort of hierarchical way, then I feel like I'm kind of already watering down something that, you know, you might end up watering down. So it's like, I think it's important to keep like...
It's not even, I think...
watering down is the wrong way to look at it.
They're not even in order though, really. Like, they're all there. And I think we've had this discussion before of like, they might be broken into those different, say, systems, whether as I said, nutrition, biomechanics, you know, physiology, whatever it is. But, and we've spoken about this when we've spoken about complex systems in some of our other talks, but it's like you have these big rocks that are going to be the influences on, you know, the emergent pattern or the emergent behavior. And your job is to work out which ones do I want to amplify now, which ones do I need to expand over time, which ones are really important for the signal to be really clean for performance. And it's not that any one is more important than the other. It's just that you've got to make sure that they're in somewhat level of harmony. And I think
some are going to be more important than other at different times.
Yes.
That's the other thing. It's very dynamic in nature.
And that's like, I think that's the challenging part, especially as you've got someone potentially who's developing and you're looking. The challenging part, I think, in all performance is getting the balance right between the performance right now and the performance in the future, and how they interact. Because, like, I'm happy to say it here. Like, I'm struggling at the moment a little bit with this concept where I've really put in I've tried to build a number of those rocks over, say, this pre-season for a number of athletes, and I think that we've done a really good job of that. But if we were to go and actually measure what their performance is right now, it's not that great. However, I think that these things create the foundation for when we amplify them, we're going to get. However, if you can't get a reasonable level of performance out of them now, potentially psychologically you lose them for the future. And the reason I bring this up is, you know, I put it in the questions that I sort of sent through as maybe some thought stimulation, was around belief. And I know you and I have had this discussion before, but how much there is an interplay between the psychology of belief and the physiology that creates. Can you maybe, like, I know you've looked into this a little bit.
I'll just say, like, if there were big ideas that I've kind of learnt more about over my time, like, I think this is one of them, in the sense that, like, now it's almost something that I would put like, if you can find an athlete that, again, is in a program where, you know, there's some good principles being applied in training, they're kind of good at self-regulation, all this, and then they just believe in what they're doing, I think, like, you're onto a winner. And I can't sit here and explain, like, mechanistically why that is. I think I've just don't know. But I feel like I've just seen it enough times, kind of thing. There's just, like, something about, like, I definitely would not call it, like, blind faith, but just something about, like, tell me which way to shoot and I'll start shooting. And just, like, that kind of almost, like, mentality and just kind of belief in what they're doing, I just think can be, like, so strong. Like, it has really influenced my practice. Like, I think, so for example, at Triathlon we did this caffeine study. Like, everyone knows caffeine works, and we just wanted to find a way to kind of, like, essentially just optimize what each athlete was doing pre-race that worked for them. And it just came down to, we literally just got 6 different types. So, like, you know, no dose, like strips, gum, like Red Bull, whatever. And all I wanted to know was that, like, if you standardize the dose, it'll work, right? It doesn't really matter what the method is. And we found that. And so basically I was able to give the recommendations like, all right, Fish, if you want to take Red Bull, take Red Bull. If you want to take no dose, take no dose. Like it
makes
like
no difference.
It's just like, as long as you have faith in what you're doing, and the way we tested that out was like, we sort of allocated all the participants all the different types of caffeine, but before we asked them, which one do you think is going to work the best and which one do you like taking the best? And generally those are the ones for each person that
had the greatest response.
That had the best response.
And I think people often forget that of this,
Yeah.
of the placebo effect.
Yeah.
You know, it's just which is documented time and again in research.
Mm.
And thinking of it as almost being like a negative thing,
Yeah.
we actually realize, actually you can use this to your advantage.
In real life performance, it's like I remember at a conference once, I'd presented on some of my altitude stuff, and I think someone was sitting next to me and was like, oh, that's like a great presentation, but like, how did you control for the placebo effect? I was like, I didn't. I want them to believe like in everything that this is about.
And more importantly, it highlights that psychology influences physiology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, if you just dismiss that, you're actually missing a big piece of the puzzle.
And in my practice now, like I've gone from kind of like making sure there's a really solid evidence base for something working. Now it's almost flipped. It's just like, I just need to have enough confidence that this isn't doing any harm. But as long as an athlete like believes in it, well then what? Like if a good example I come back to is like compression. Like it's probably not probably. It's definitely not the thing that's going to like put you over the top in terms of like performance, right? But some athletes just love sleeping in them, spending like 22 hours a day in them and things like that. I know it's not going to be negative in any way to their performance. So it's like, go for your life.
Yeah.
Like I think that's like my thoughts on recovery science in part are very, very much shaped by placebo and belief effects and things like that. One of my close colleagues at the AIS, he did this really awesome study where he basically just came up with this idea that he tried to blind ice baths. And the way he did it was he essentially had three conditions. So the ice bath condition, the thermoneutral condition, and then a thermoneutral condition where he told the participants that he essentially put like some recovery like tonic in the water. All it was Vaseline.
I've read this stuff.
And like it came out exactly the same as the ice bath in terms of recovery. And I just think like stuff like that is so cool.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that like, provided that there's principles in place around the interventions that you are adopting, belief's often the thing that's going to like make it really go over the top.
All right. Here's the question that I wanted to bring up because I've gotten interested in this and Jack tells me that I'm an idiot. But there seems to be a high proportion of high-level athletes that are spiritually religious.
I was hoping you'd ask this as
right?
well.
And they have, as you said, they have a level of spiritual faith.
Yeah.
It seems in some ways to be disproportionate, and maybe that's just because you're taking note of it as you're seeing,
I was going to say, no one's ever going to report an atheist athlete winning. It's like
it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't exactly.
It's not obvious, right? And that's probably the case because I'm sure it probably still is the majority. What effect do you think that has on things like belief, and does it interact with this kind of level of belief in your, say, performance or training?
I don't know. Like I feel like I would guess yes, because I think there's something to be said for like I hear in certain interviews like post a really good performance, like an athlete will say like, all glory to God. And I feel like that's in itself, it's almost like outsourcing the responsibility in a healthy way, because I think there's this underlying belief that like I can train really well and all this stuff, but in the end it's all down to my faith.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a way of like harnessing that in a good way, because it's like you're not so like caught up in like being like
totally responsible.
And like we said something earlier that I think sort of around like the emotional regulation, and you don't like dwell on something for so long. Like I wonder if there's like a link.
There has to be, because when things go wrong, a lot of those athletes you'll say, it wasn't in God's plan.
But,
right? And as someone who's not religious, you go, well, that sounds ridiculous. Right? But I think, as you just mentioned, like potentially that allows you to move on quickly because you say, yes, I didn't perform how I wanted. I will obviously, if it's in, again, and you do the opposite thing, you go, if it's in the plan, I will work out how to solve this problem.
To me, it's kind of like a bit of horses for course, because as I said before, like I think it's a bit of a like, it's a false thing, because I think there's by the statistics, there'd be more atheist athletes than religious athletes, and they still do well. It's just because. So I just think it's like you need things in place that make it work for you. So if like an athlete that is religious kind of goes down this sort of complex of like, okay, it's all part of God's plan or not part of God's plan, like I think that clearly works for them for whatever reason, in the same way that like an athlete who's non-spiritual or non-religious, like they'll have things in place that work for them, and it might be related to like them actually taking full responsibility for everything. I don't know.
Well, but I actually look at it as they're both kind of similar because they both believe in the system that they're involved in. And I feel like for religious people, perhaps one of the advantages they have is they believe in something greater than themselves. So there's that openness to going like, I am capable of so much more. Where if you're an atheist, you still believe in the system that you're involved in. Like you believe that I've done the training, therefore I know I'm the best and I'm going to win. So it's still that similar outcome of I believe that I can achieve this.
I almost, as much as it sounds silly, I have been thinking about the concept of, say, religious faith as almost like a toolkit that is similar to doing, say, psychological training to learn how to believe in something that's, say, greater than you, or believe in something outside of your own control, or have the ability to accept those things that you can't control. And for that reason, I think that they take that skill set from their religious practice into other areas of their life. And it's not that it gives them an advantage or not, it's just that it's another tool that they have in their bag of things. You know, it's not going to be, as you said before, I don't think it's the thing that separates them from one or the other. But if it's something you have in your toolkit that you have the ability to believe in something that's removed from you, that you maybe don't have control over, that potentially is a tool that is beneficial for you in some 100%. Aspect of your performance.
I think this like higher power, greater power thing is really, really interesting. Like Swimming Australia did something super cool a couple of years ago in their like relay stuff. And it's like the simplest experiment, but I think it's fascinating. Is essentially swimming's real easy, right? Because they like
don't tell them that.
No. As in, it's easy to do controlled experiments because of the setting.
I thought you said you're making out the
sports.
No.
The sport's very, very difficult. But essentially, what they did was they had athletes go off with like 100-meter time trials, easy to measure, easy to do, nice and controlled. Then all they did was they put them in, gave them a bit of recovery, then put them in 2-up relay teams and did the exact same thing, and just compared each athlete's split when they were swimming for themselves versus when they were swimming in a team. And then they just went and picked the athletes that split faster when they were swimming in a team, obviously correcting for like the flying start and all this stuff. But I think that is so interesting.
And what were the results? Were there a lot of people that did swim faster when they were swimming?
Most athletes would have swum faster when they...
Swimming for the team.
Swimming for the team kind of thing. I mean, there would have been some athletes that swam faster for themselves, but then that just like reveals you, like it's not a like, you know, a definitive fact, but I think that would make me ask curious questions about like, why did they swim faster for themselves as opposed to a team kind of thing? And I think like that's the sort of thing that I'd be, if I was putting teams together, that's the sort of stuff that I'd be looking at as wanting to like, you know, have a discussion about.
Because it's not just about yourself, then it's about other people. You don't you don't really care. Well, I'm sure they do care if they let down themselves, but then if they let down other people, it actually affects them more negatively.
After the Rio Olympics, Swimming Australia brought out this guy called Frank Bush, who had been the head coach of US swimming for a number of Olympic cycles, and it was really, really fascinating because, again, at the point that I was in my career, I was coming in expecting to hear about, we've got this like U-Butte taper and like this great altitude training, all this stuff. And all he talked about was just like these very methodical processes of how they just build a team culture from like so their selection trials like 5 weeks out, and like it's all these activities they have in place to just build the team in the interim between their trials and the major event.
I find it fascinating. I think I've told you, I noticed this when I was over in Tokyo looking at the swimming team and how cohesive they were. And people think this is critical, but I think it's one of the things that's missing from the athletics team. Right? And I don't know whether you're involved in that process at all, but it's something that I think that if they added, because within the athletes themselves, I think that there is a very good culture, right? And there is team cohesion, and people really like each other and they support each other, and that was really nice. Like that was one of the things that I thought was the most noticeable between Australia and other countries in Tokyo was there were a lot of athletes coming to watch the team on days when they weren't competing or if they'd finished compared to other teams. right? And, you know, people were making signs and doing all sorts of stuff and just being rowdy Australians, which was great, right? But the thing that was interesting is not a lot of that was being driven from necessarily the performance team. And there's some really good people in there now, so I'm interested to see whether they start to build more of those team cultural things, because it's, in my mind at least, and I'm naive, I haven't been involved long enough to know, so I apologise if anyone sees that as you know, just ignorance, but I don't see that we've ever had a culture like that in the same way that I saw with the swimming.
I've been involved even shorter than you, but I think that's, I don't know how, maybe because I grew up playing team sports. That's always been my orientation, is like, what can we do? To me, it's almost like free time, really, as in free time that you're trying to improve your performance by, because I think like these cultural elements, sure, there's no mechanistic explanation for it, but creating a good environment to support performance, that's got to be a good thing. Like, I think
there's some good evolutionary explanations for it, because you know the fact that we are social, individual social animals.
And I think like, and it's even just little things, like, again, trying to draw back on stuff that I do know. Like, there's research out there showing that like if you warm down in a good mood with your colleagues, like things like the cortisol response and the hormone response are way different as compared to if you get like a roast from your, like, you know, straight after a poor performance or something like that. And I think all of that, to me, it just points in the same direction around like how we should try and create teams and environments to support, you know, what we're doing.
All right, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, and this probably, maybe we're talking about it now, is like, where do you think innovation is going to come from in performance?
I think got two answers to this. One sort of like...
apologies if you can hear noise. Some jerk is doing some trade stuff outside.
How dare they on their Sunday?
One sort of more scientific and one's kind of less so. So the scientific one is, I think the innovation will come in individualization of training.
How do you see that playing out?
It's a great question. Like, I don't necessarily know if it's like because we're getting better at sort of measuring things through like things like wearables and things like that, or it's just like people are just getting better at making decisions or coaching as there's more knowledge to like draw on. But that's where I really see it going, in the sense that like like anyone who's been, whether they're a coach, a physiologist, a physio, whatever, anyone who's been working in the same environment for a while, that you should get better at making your decisions right, and you should develop tools, whether they're like, you know, formal things like being able to take more measures, or just through intuition and observation, that one thing is working for another person that may not be working as optimally for another person. And I just think, at least in my context within physiology, like there's been a lot more discussions within our network around like, okay, how do we move to the next step of like making sure every athlete has like the best individually tailored program for them. The other one, which I don't know, just because of my bias, I'm way more interested in, is just how performance teams work together. And I just find that's big. I just find that really, really fascinating, in the sense of like, you know, where does each member sit? What is the role of the coach? What is the role of the physiologist? What's the role of the athlete? The way I think about it now is like, in a performance team, we sort of have this language in Australia, this sort of like athletes, coaches, and performance support. I kind of like reject that in a way, if I'm being completely honest, and I just would rather think of everyone in a performance team where, and it doesn't even have to be sport, like in our context, the athlete is the one that delivers the performance, but they could be like a musician, a ballet dancer, or whatever. And then the coach, again, as coming to what I said before, is generally the one that kind of like is a coordinator, like sets where everything fits in like the complex system and stuff. And then you have a variety of other, like a rotating cast that kind of comes in and out and like supports the performance. But again, like, yes, my role is to bring sound physiological principles to what I do, but that does not constrain like how I should impact the team. Like I'm in the fortunate position that I'm full-time in one sport. I work with a lot of my colleagues that are either half-time in one sport, half-time in another, or just their whole job is like 3 days a week. And so one of my roles is actually to like create opportunities for them to have impact where it's more important than for me to have impact, because I actually think it'd be quite dangerous for like a physiologist to be at all times like the main voice that's in the coach's ear, just because I'm the one that has the time to be that voice kind of thing. And so I think that's an area of development that if done correctly, could be really, really interesting and quite beneficial for performance.
Yeah, that makes me think a lot about, again, this wording that Jack mentioned, a colleague of ours who's physio and is now working in elite sport, and the environment that he's in is a really interesting one. He's not enjoying it that much because he said that the performance team culture and the coaching structure has become one about reducing injuries and creating availability.
Yeah.
And he's, even as a physio, his main point is, well, we're here to perform.
Yeah.
We're not here to have less injuries than the other team. We're here to beat the other teams. And he's not saying like we want more injuries, but he said like because the culture is one where everyone's so shit scared of someone getting hurt or the injury list and the injury numbers and the availability data, they're more willing to change training if someone pulls up poorly from something and they're tracking, you know, the rehabilitation data more closely almost than they are the performance stuff. And he's like, we're missing the point here. And he's like, I think the culture needs to change of one of like, he's not saying, you know, we just throw all the eggs at the wall and the ones that don't break, but he's also saying like, we need to be willing to push a little bit because ultimately what we want is performance.
Yeah. To me, like I find, like, I don't know what the right terms are here, but to me, like, I still think the people that may be falling into the trap of looking at scrutinizing the injury data more, I still think they're trying to influence performance, but they're doing it in like what I would call like, it's just like a linear way. It's like the way I'm going to influence performance is by reducing injuries. Whereas if you adopted like a complex systems way of thinking is like all these things that aren't really in order can influence performance at a given time. And so that's how it actually works.
I'm going to see it as like, you know, it's like the via positivity, via negativity thing. It's like, you're thinking by taking away injuries that's going to lead to performance.
Like a lot of the time it actually makes performance worse.
Yeah. Well, it's this false, I think, idea that availability means that people will play well. Yeah. And just because they're on the field doesn't mean they're in form, doesn't mean that they're, you know, performing at their best.
You guys would know this. If someone could show me like 100 papers that prospectively showed cause and effect between reducing injuries and performance, and we'd all be having a different conversation. Yeah. But they're all just like point in time retrospective analysis. Like some papers show, oh, this team that won happened to have like less injuries, but then where's the cause and effect? Like I just find that fascinating. And that's like this is where I keep coming back to this like this practice-based research sort of thing. Is I think like if you sit in a realm where a lot of people who came up as clinicians or practitioners and things like that, at some point in our career we sat there, you're just looking at the research, like it actually just doesn't fit what we're trying to do, which is like in a completely different context. Is like I had a conversation with a colleague the other day around a student that we both supervise in a training camp thing, and it was actually discussed like, oh, we need the training program to look like this, and because even though you know, it's a training camp, the science needs to take priority. And again, it's not that I like reject that idea, it's just that like, but if you zoom out a little bit and it's like, well, what is the purpose of doing the research in the first place? Like surely it's to increase performance at the end of the day. And so like if you're doing it in a non-ecologically valid way, well then like that's already watering down.
It's already manipulating the environment.
So it's just like, and again, that's not something that's going to be solved overnight because, you know, there's, you know, if you're at a university, you generally have like, you know, got to get a certain amount of publications and citations and all these different things. And then we have different rules that we play by in sort of sport and things like that. And so it's like, for me, this whole thing about performance teams is like, how do you actually get priorities aligned, everyone moving in the same direction, but like in a very almost like fluid way?
Well, that's something I certainly noticed within our profession. I feel like it's such a limitation to improving is we currently see researchers dominating what is done, what should be done in terms of managing certain injuries. And part of the issue with that is researchers are not very good at communicating how their research fits in with the bigger picture. I find that's quite frustrating when you hear someone speak and they'll talk about their research as if that is the only research that exists. And it's really poor messaging for clinicians who don't know any better. But and with that in mind, there's a question I was going to ask you, you know, talking about like improving performance. In your experience, do you feel like in sports medicine, high performance teams outside of coaching that they're very open to being holistic with all the information you collect, or do you feel like there's a lot of pressure for you to be able to always justify what you do from a very scientific or research base?
No, but In a word, no. Like I think, but then I would say I don't know whether it's because of the way I bring myself to a team, which is generally pretty non-adversarial. Like I still back myself into what I think and say, but at the same time, like my journey has led me to a point of like one of my philosophies is kind of like everything works and everything at a certain time can be right. It's just like finding out when the right time for that is. And so, no, I don't feel pressure that I always need to like justify everything. I guess how I think of it is like at the end of the day, we're trying to find a solution that is generally improved performance, and how we get there. Sometimes it might be led by the clinician, sometimes it might be led by the physiologist, sometimes it might be led by the coach, but it's just like, again, kind of like sound principles, logic and things like that, and then some sort of iterative process of seeing if it actually works. But I can't speak for like, I think in the team that I'm currently in, I think we just went through a process of having our KPIs like very clearly articulated to us. We sort of go through that process like every 6 to 12 months just as a refresher. And I think that's in itself has helped us all be on the same page around like our priority is not reducing injuries. Our priority is not like, getting the highest VO2 max. It's just like we need athletes to be, I think it's within 1% of their season's best at the benchmark event. And we need like this many good performances and this many this. So it's like purely like black and white objective. Like that's what we're going for. And that actually makes it really easy to kind of like
measure that.
Yeah.
I think it's probably the last thing that I'll ask you, but I've been asking a lot of people this question recently, which is, I tend to find with curious and intelligent people, they've got some sort of idea or thought gnawing away at them in the background that they would love to know the answer to. Is there something or a few things at the moment that kind of are sitting in the back there that you every now and then will touch on and have a bit of a look at or think about?
I think the performance teams one for me is a really big one. Like I'm really sort of...
Well, on that, what are you looking at? What kind of stuff? I know you sent me some of that stuff that was from that Harvard review. I think it was from a Harvard
article. Things like I recently learnt about a thing called like a leadership maturity framework. And so it was kind of this article from HBR like maybe 20 years ago. And it sort of like presented people as... I won't remember all of them, but there's like diplomats, experts, reframers, alchemists and things like that. And it's just the way it was presented in that article is sort of like very linear in the sense that like, all right, you're this at the start, then you progress to a diplomat, then you progress to an expert, then you progress to this, then you progress to this. The way that it was presented to us in this course was around like, at any time you should have a really good leader will have traits of all of these that they'll be able to kind of like mix and match. Something that I am really interested in, and in my role currently, apart from like, when I get pulled into a workshop to like survey what the organisation thinks, I'm not in a position to influence it, but that doesn't mean I'm not interested, is that I think at the moment the way our teams are put together is like there'll be sort of some kind of like analysis done on the demands of the sport and things like that, and they'll be like, okay, we're talking about middle distance runners here, and so they're going to need a physiologist, they're going to need a dietitian, they're going to need like S&C, whatever. Because of the way the system is set up, and then in athletics, because most of our coaches are not employed in the system, they kind of either employ themselves or they actually have a job that's completely different and they're just volunteers. The coaches aren't consulted in that. And so generally, like I was allocated to John as an example. Like he had no say in who his physiologist was going to be. He was just like, okay, this is Avish, he's just started as physiologist, he's going to come work with you. Great. I think what would be really interesting, and I don't actually know how you would practically do this, is like looking at teams as not just complementary disciplines working together, but complementary like behavioural profiles and things like that. Yeah. And so like, I think we get along pretty well, but it would have been a disaster if we just like clashed the whole time and couldn't work together. But that's like...
No, we would have told you not to come.
Well, I guess that's also a pretty good outcome. But then it's also about having more people that would have the confidence just to say that.
Well, I think you'd find that most coaches that are experienced enough are not going to have that problem. Have you found coaches that you don't really like?
There are sometimes, like not so much recently, but there have been times where I've been frustrated, almost like, I've been followed in like a blind Freddy kind of way, and I was like, no, I'd actually like to be questioned because I'm not certain about this myself. So I think more and more, like I think just because again most of the coaches I work with have been doing it for quite a long time, some may be like, younger like yourself and older, but it doesn't mean they haven't been coaching for a while. But yeah, I think now I've sort of got a good mix of people that are like kind of self-assured in their own way, but then...
Well, it's funny you say that self-assured stuff. I think about this often about one of the things, and, people can take this however they like, but I think the increasing visibility of, say, being, politically correct is actually a major problem when it comes to performance teams. And I don't say that in the sense of like that you should be in any way derogatory towards people or anything like that. But one of the things I think is really important in performance teams is total transparency. And sometimes transparency, or at least these days, transparency is often being interpreted as, being rude or being overly direct that's hurtful towards someone. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in good operators in the performance space is, and it really matters how you deliver it, but at the same time, like there shouldn't be any conversations that can't be had. And there shouldn't be any topics that can't be touched upon. And often I feel like, and this is something that it'd be interesting to know what you think, but I think with places like the Victorian Institute of Sport, which is a government organisation, there is a level of conservatism that is sewn into the fabric of what they do. And the good thing is there are good people there now, at least in the athletics program, and that's changing. But like a simple example of that is the bureaucracy around, say, getting access to Lakeside Stadium. But I just feel like if some of the predecessors had actually just said to the management, fucking work this out. Right?
It's a really because another story that's completely the same is I was at a conference recently, and one of the swim coaches that I used to work with, he was there, and he's sort of at the point now that he's actually stepped away from day-to-day coaching. He's someone that's been to multiple Olympics, very successful, but now he's at the point in his career he sort of wants to take more of an overseeing role and spend more time with his family. And he was telling me that he was invited, I think, to the AIS or something, and they were like, okay, mate, like we want to know like all your big ideas and things like that. Like we're planning like the Brisbane strategy for 2032, and we need to know like, what are the things that we're going to like underpin this on. And he was just like, fucking, you guys can't even get me like a TV on pool deck that works so I can like film my swimmers and give me like instantaneous feedback. So go solve that, and then I will worry about these big ideas. It's not that I don't have them, but you guys aren't hearing them until like you fix this. And I think like, again, I don't use the term like basics mentality because I want to like stifle innovation and things like that, because that's really important. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of like the day-to-day fundamental stuff that's actually going to like move the needle a lot more if you get it right. And I think like it's not sexy though, is it? No, it's not. But honestly, like I think I've become more comfortable in like, even like I think about how I work with John is like, you're pretty well read, a lot about a lot of different things. And sometimes I just think my role is to like kind of sometimes keep things on the straight and narrow and just be like, okay, what are the fundamental principles of this training prescription? And it's like, how are we shifting the needle? Like, and again, we're still going to have the conversations about like, a different rehabilitation technique for an athlete at a given time or a different way of doing things. But as long as we don't lose sight of like
what's key.
Yeah. And I think sometimes in this like, again, if you think about Australian sport as like kind of like just like any other like capitalist industry, right? Like you're trying to, it's all people in competition with each other. They're all trying to like make a profit or win, and there's limited resources. So it's like the stuff that stands out is going to get noticed, but is that always the stuff that's going to, I don't know,
to drive the performance?
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you wanted to ask, Jack?
No, I'm all good.
Anything you wanted to add before we sign off?
No. I think I'm pretty good. There was something else I was like, really, you said, what are you curious about at the moment? I had it before, but I think I've forgotten. We'll leave it at that.
Sure?
Yeah, no, it was like performance teams, but then, no, I've actually just forgotten.
Next time.
Next time. We'll definitely probably have you back on. Avish, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Really appreciate it.
Cheers.